My own grandson spat in my face while the turkey was still warm on the table. That was the moment I understood the holiday had turned into something unholy, that the same family I had fed, clothed, and sheltered for decades now looked at me as if I were nothing more than an obstacle between them and what they wanted. It happened on Thanksgiving, the day people like to parade as a celebration of gratitude, unity, and respect for elders. But in my house, in that cramped dining room filled with the smell of sweet potatoes, collard greens, and cornbread, the meaning of gratitude had been twisted into a cruel performance. My 14-year-old grandson, Jaden, leaned back in his chair, smirking like he was auditioning for cruelty, and when I tried to calm the room by saying a prayer over the food, he curled his lips and spat directly into my face. The warm wetness sliding down my cheek wasn't just spit. It was the erasure of every bedtime story, every ride to school, every pair of sneakers I had scraped money together to buy for him. What cut deeper than the act itself was the silence that followed. My son Mark averted his eyes and reached for his glass of wine as though nothing had happened. His wife Kayla sat perfectly still, her painted nails tapping the edge of her plate in quiet triumph, as if she had been waiting for this moment to humiliate me publicly. Not a single person at that table told Jaden he was wrong. Not one voice rose to defend me. And for the first time in my own home, surrounded by my blood, I felt like a stranger trespassing in a space I had built. The air thickened into a silence so sharp it pressed against my skin. And then, 5 minutes later, came the knock that split the room in half. It wasn't just any knock. It was the heavy, deliberate pounding of authority, the sound of doors that lead to consequences. I wiped my cheek with the edge of my apron and walked stiffly to the door, my body shaking though I wanted to appear steady. When I opened it, the cold air swept in along with two women in grey coats holding clipboards, badges clipped to their collars. Child Protective Services. They didn't smile, didn't greet me with warmth. They stepped inside as if they had already been told what kind of monster to expect, their eyes scanning my home, measuring every corner as if the truth was written in the dust on the shelves. "We received a call," one of them said flatly, her voice stripped of any humanity, "about possible unsafe conditions in this household." In that second, I knew what was happening. I had been set up, pushed into a trap where my age, my race, my vulnerability could all be used against me. I thought of how quick the system is to believe the narrative of a struggling black grandmother being unfit. How many times I had seen on the evening news stories about children removed from homes, not because they were unsafe, but because the state had decided it knew better. My stomach twisted with the knowledge that the very people who should have had my back, my own son and his wife, were standing behind me, ready to nod along with every accusation, ready to throw me under the bus for the sake of convenience or greed. I had worked my whole life to hold this family together. I was born in Alabama in the 60s, came of age when schools were still learning how to desegregate, when every step into a grocery store meant eyes following you like you were out of place. I learned early how to fight with dignity, how to keep my head high even when the world wanted it bowed. I moved north, worked double shifts as a nurse's aide, scrubbed other people's floors, cleaned offices at night, all so my children could have what I never did. I bought this house 30 years ago with the down payment saved from countless hours of labor, and I told myself it would be the safe place, the place no one could take from me, a home filled with food, warmth, and memories. But now, on the holiday meant to honor that very labor, I was standing in my own doorway, accused of being unfit to care for a child I had practically raised since birth. Jaden, the boy who had just spit on me, now played the role of the innocent. He wiped his mouth, hunched his shoulders, lowered his eyes to the floor like a rehearsed act. And Kayla, his mother, whispered to the social worker, her voice dripping with false concern. "She's been getting forgetful. Sometimes she yells for no reason. I'm just worried about what he's exposed to here." The words slid like knives into my back. Forgetful. Yelling. What about the bills I paid with my pension check every month? What about the groceries I hauled in with aching knees while she ordered beauty supplies online? What about the electricity that stayed on because I scraped together every dime while they spent theirs on vacations I wasn't invited to? But none of that mattered in that moment, because the narrative was already being written against me, and all I could do was stand there, holding my apron, the turkey cooling on the table behind me, while strangers wrote down notes that could decide my fate. I wanted to scream, to flip the table, to shout at them all for their betrayal, but something inside me told me to hold it in. I remembered the warnings of my mother, who lived long enough to remind me. They already think you're angry. Don't give them proof. So I swallowed the rage burning in my chest. But I knew, deep in my bones, that the fight for my dignity had just begun. The social worker's pen scratched across the paper, as if she was etching my guilt into stone before I even had the chance to breathe. She looked around the dining room, her eyes catching the turkey, the greens, the cornbread I had spent 2 days preparing, but instead of seeing a home, she seemed to be scanning for evidence of decay, disorder, or danger. "Ma'am," she said, and I could tell she was already rehearsing the tone of authority. "We received a call about possible neglect and verbal abuse in this household. We take these matters very seriously." Her words dropped like lead weights into the silence that had hung in the air since Jaden's spit landed on my cheek. Behind me, Kayla gasped in a way that was more theatre than truth, clutching her chest as though she were the victim of something tragic. "That's exactly what we've been trying to tell you," she said quickly, seizing the moment, turning her eyes toward the social worker as if they were sisters in concern. "She's unstable. She screams at Jaden. She tells him he's worthless. And we've been so worried about the environment here. We didn't want to say anything, but we couldn't stay quiet any longer." I stood rooted to the floor, the same hardwood I had mopped countless times, the same boards that had carried birthday balloons, graduation caps, and even the casket of my husband when we held his wake here. Those floors knew my truth, but the stranger with the clipboard didn't care about the years of sacrifice. She only cared about the story being told, and Kayla was painting me as a tyrant. Mark stood behind her, silent but nodding, adding weight to the accusation with every slow dip of his head. My son, my only son, the boy I raised by myself when his father died in a factory accident, the boy whose lunches I packed, whose fevers I cooled, now stood and silently co-signed my destruction. I wanted to grab him, shake him, demand to know how he could stand there and let his wife recite lies that erased the life we had lived together. But all I could do was watch as he chose her over me. Jaden sniffled, the sound of a child rehearsed in innocence, and the social worker turned toward him. "Do you feel safe here?" she asked softly, her pen hovering above the paper like a blade waiting to strike. He shifted in his chair, eyes darting toward his parents, and then looked back at her. "Sometimes she yells," he whispered, his voice small, calculated to draw sympathy. "Sometimes she tells me I don't do enough, and sometimes I'm scared." His words rang in my ears, each syllable hammering against my ribs like a fist. Scared. This boy had broken my favorite lamp last week and laughed in my face when I told him to pick up his dirty clothes. He had slammed doors so hard the hinges nearly snapped. He had stood taller than me now, a teenager full of arrogance, yet he played the victim so well that even I could feel the weight of his performance. The social worker nodded slowly, scribbling on her paper as though she had just uncovered some profound truth, when in reality, all she had was the echo of a lie. I tried to speak, to interrupt, to tell her the truth of what really happened in this house. I opened my mouth and said, "I am the one paying the bills. I am the one cooking the meals. I am the one who—" But Kayla cut me off with a sharp voice that sliced through the room. "You see how aggressive she gets? We can't say a word without her trying to dominate the conversation. This is what we deal with every single day. It's exhausting, and it's not healthy for Jaden." I froze, my words stolen from me, and in that moment I realized the trap had been perfectly set. No matter what I said, it would be twisted against me. If I stayed quiet, I would appear guilty. If I defended myself, I would be painted as hostile. I was in the kind of no-win scenario that so many black women before me had warned about. Damned if you speak, damned if you don't. The second social worker, younger, with braids tucked neatly under a scarf, kept glancing at me as though she wanted to believe me. But professionalism forced her to keep her face neutral. She walked toward the hallway, peeking into the bedrooms, checking the bathroom, scanning the kitchen. I wanted to tell her about the sleepless nights I spent making sure the fridge was stocked, about the morning I found Kayla leaving expired milk for Jaden while I ran to the store for fresh groceries, about the hours I spent sewing patches into his school uniforms because his parents spent their money on themselves. But none of that was visible in a quick inspection. A stranger only saw what the family wanted her to see, and right now, the story being pushed forward was that I was unstable, unfit, maybe even dangerous. Mark finally spoke, his voice low, practiced, like a man reluctantly telling a painful truth. "She's been under a lot of stress," he said, sighing heavily, pretending his heart was heavy with the burden of honesty. "Ever since Dad passed, she hasn't been the same. Sometimes she lashes out. We've tried to handle it privately, but it's getting worse. And now Jaden is the one suffering." I felt the words pierce me deeper than Jaden's spit. My son had just reduced me to a stereotype, a grieving, unstable widow, incapable of managing her own household. He didn't mention how I had saved him from eviction, how I had helped him buy his first car, how I had taken in his child when they couldn't afford daycare. He erased every sacrifice with a single, calculated statement, and the social worker nodded as if it were gospel. Inside my chest, my heart hammered with both rage and terror. I had seen this story before. I had seen grandmothers lose custody of their grandchildren because of accusations spun out of thin air, because the system often chose the younger, more polished voices over the older, weary ones. I had watched neighbours pack up their lives in cardboard boxes when the state came to investigate, and never returned their children. I had seen the way my community was judged harsher, our parenting scrutinized deeper, our mistakes magnified while our love was minimized. And now that weight was pressing against me, suffocating me as I stood in my own dining room, the smell of roasted turkey growing stale as the accusations filled the air. The younger social worker returned from her inspection and whispered something to her colleague, who nodded. They asked to sit at the table, and Kayla rushed to clear space for them, moving aside the dishes as though the meal I had prepared meant nothing. They opened their folders, asked questions in calm voices, but each one was a trap. Have there been incidents of shouting? Has anyone in the home felt unsafe? Do you ever feel overwhelmed with caregiving responsibilities? I knew that however I answered, they would bend it against me, and I realized then that the real battle was not just against my family's betrayal, but against a system designed to mistrust women like me. I forced myself to sit still, my hands folded tightly in my lap, and as I listened to Kayla embellish her lies, I promised myself that I would not go down quietly. They could twist my words. They could frame me as a villain. But I would find a way to bring the truth into the light. I had fought too hard all my life to let my name be tarnished by the people who were supposed to love me most. The questioning went on for what felt like hours, though the hands on the clock above the mantel barely moved. Every time I tried to answer, my voice seemed to dissolve beneath the weight of Kayla's interruptions, Mark's false sighs of concern, and Jaden's carefully timed little shudders of fear. The social workers leaned forward, pens moving quickly, recording words that twisted the life I had built into something unrecognizable. It was like watching my entire history get rewritten in front of me by people who hadn't lived a single day of my struggle. I wanted to shout that I was the one who had held this family together through storms, who had fed them when cupboards were bare, who had taken on night shifts so my son could have clean clothes for school. But my voice was treated as background, noise, something to be noted and dismissed. Kayla leaned into her performance with a grace that chilled me. She pressed her hand to her chest, as though her heart was breaking, and described how she feared leaving Jaden alone with me, how sometimes she would hear me ranting in the kitchen, speaking to myself as though I were unstable, how she had caught me slamming doors and throwing things when I thought no one was watching. None of it was true, but she spun the words with such confidence that even I felt myself shrinking beneath them. She looked the part too, her hair neatly pinned, her makeup soft and tasteful, her voice gentle but firm. She knew exactly what the social workers wanted to hear, and she gave it to them like she had rehearsed it for weeks. Mark added his part with subtle nods, the occasional phrase of agreement, letting her shine while still bolstering her claims. It was a dance they had perfected together, and I was the unwilling audience. The workers asked about finances, and Kayla immediately spoke up about how I insisted on controlling the grocery money, how I sometimes refused to give her cash for Jaden's needs, how I would make decisions without consulting them. My mouth fell open because the truth was the opposite. It was my pension check that kept the refrigerator full, my savings that paid for Jaden's school trips, my name on the utility bills that kept the lights on. Yet in the story she told, I was a miserly tyrant who clutched pennies while the boy went without. I felt the walls of my own home bend around me, shifting into a theatre where reality no longer mattered, where the narrative was king. The social workers began to circle the questions closer, their eyes flicking to me with suspicion. "Do you ever feel overwhelmed by the responsibilities of caring for your grandson?" one asked, her voice clinical, detached. I wanted to tell her about the joy I had felt when Jaden was small, when he would climb into my lap and rest his head against my chest, when I thought my love was enough to protect him from the hardness of the world. I wanted to tell her how I stayed up through nights of fevers, how I held him when nightmares woke him, how I sacrificed shoes for myself so his feet could be warm in winter. But what spilled out instead was the truth they would twist. I do more than anyone in this house, and sometimes I feel used. The words hung in the air like a confession, and I saw Kayla's lips curve in a hidden smile. Mark leaned forward, putting on his mask of weary son. "You see?" he said softly. "She admits it herself. She feels used, and she takes it out on Jaden. We've tried to support her, but she doesn't want help, and we can't just stand by while our child suffers." My stomach twisted with fury, because the only suffering happening in this house was mine, the kind that came from being erased while still alive, from being treated like an intruder in a space I had bought with my sweat. Yet with every word he spoke, I felt myself losing ground. The workers asked to speak with Jaden alone, and my heart sank. He followed them into the living room, his shoulders slumped, his face drawn into a picture of innocence that belied the arrogance he had shown just minutes before when he spit on me. They asked him questions in soft tones, writing down every hesitant word, and from where I sat I could hear fragments. She yells. She scares me. I don't like being here. Each phrase was a dagger, not because it was true, but because it was powerful, because it came from the mouth of a child, and children are believed even when they lie. I remembered the boy he used to be, the one who used to bring me drawings from school, who used to laugh when I sang to him in the kitchen. And I wondered when he had learned that betraying me would earn him love from his parents. When they finished, the workers came back with faces carefully neutral, but I knew what they had heard. They asked a few more questions about routines, meals, schoolwork, discipline. I tried to answer with dignity, explaining that I woke up early every morning to prepare breakfast, that I checked his homework, that I reminded him to brush his teeth. But Kayla cut in with derision, saying she often had to redo everything because I was forgetful, that my breakfasts were unhealthy, that I nagged him about homework rather than helping. Every memory I offered was painted over with her venom until the picture of me was nothing but a shadow of incompetence and cruelty. The escalation wasn't just in their words, it was in the atmosphere. The social workers' pens moved faster, their glances sharper, their questions more pointed. "Has there ever been physical discipline?" one asked, her eyes boring into me as if she expected me to confess to striking him. My body went rigid, and I said, "Never." I would never raise a hand to him. But Kayla tilted her head and said, "She doesn't realize when she gets rough. Even if she doesn't mean it, sometimes her grip is too hard, and Jaden has bruises." My heart nearly stopped, because that was the ultimate weapon, the suggestion of physical harm. I looked at Jaden, praying he would deny it, praying he would remember every gentle hand I had laid on his shoulder, every soft hug, every kiss to his forehead. But he only lowered his gaze and said nothing, which to the workers was the same as agreement. I wanted to collapse right there, but something inside me refused to bend. I sat up straighter, forced my voice to remain steady, and said, "If there are bruises on that boy, they did not come from me. I have been the one protecting him, the one keeping this house standing. Look around you. Every piece of furniture, every dish, every dollar in this house has my fingerprints on it. If I were unfit, they wouldn't be living here. They are trying to push me out because they want what I built." My words echoed with desperation, but I meant every one of them. The social workers exchanged a glance, and I knew they heard not just a defense, but the cry of a woman who understood she was being framed in her own home. The questioning slowed, but the tension did not. They closed their folders, thanked us for our time, and said they would be back for follow-ups, maybe even unannounced visits. The implication was clear. My life was now under surveillance. As they walked to the door, Kayla followed them with a look of quiet satisfaction, Mark with his practiced sorrow, Jaden trailing behind them like a shadow. I sat at the table, the turkey untouched, the candles burned low, my face still burning with the memory of spit. When the door closed, the silence was deafening. Kayla turned to me, her lips curling into the smallest of smirks, and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "It's only a matter of time." Mark avoided my eyes, retreating into the kitchen, while Jaden stomped upstairs, slamming his door like a punctuation mark, and I sat there, staring at the empty plates, realizing that the first battle had been lost, but the war had just begun. The night after the social workers left, the house felt colder than it had in years, not because the thermostat had been turned down, but because trust had drained from the walls like warmth leaking through a broken window. I sat alone at the dining table, staring at the turkey that had gone untouched, at the candied yams now congealed into a sticky mass, at the cranberry sauce drying along the edge of the plate. It looked less like a feast and more like a crime scene, a silent witness to betrayal. My hands trembled as I picked at the crust of cornbread, not out of hunger, but out of the need to keep from breaking down. I knew that the social worker's visit was only the beginning, that their presence had planted a seed of suspicion that would grow if I didn't find a way to fight back. The following morning, I rose before dawn, the way I always had, because old habits do not break, simply because the world has shifted against you. I boiled water for tea, fried bacon, scrambled eggs, and put toast on the table. But the food sat untouched. Kayla emerged from her room, dressed immaculately as if she had somewhere important to be, though I knew her only plans were to meet friends and spend hours at the nail salon. She looked at the spread and sneered softly, not with words but with her eyes, before pouring herself coffee and leaving crumbs on the counter. Mark came down later, briefcase in hand, speaking on his phone in the voice he used to impress clients, not even acknowledging me as he walked out the door. Jaden shuffled down after them, earbuds lodged firmly in his ears, ignoring the plate I had prepared for him. When I told him to sit and eat, he glared at me with the same contempt I had once only seen from his mother. "I don't need you," he muttered, and the words cut deeper than I expected, because they carried not just the arrogance of a teenager, but the disdain of someone who had been coached to reject me. After they left, the house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ache of my own breathing. I went to the bathroom to wash my face, and as I pulled back my sleeve, I saw the fading purple bruise on my arm from where Jaden had grabbed me the week before when I told him to turn off the video games and do his homework. I touched it lightly, not out of pain, but out of recognition. That bruise was more than a mark on my skin. It was proof of what was really happening in this house, proof that I was not the aggressor, but the one enduring aggression. For a moment, I considered taking a picture of it, but my hands shook at the thought. What if no one believed me? What if the photo was dismissed as something I had done to myself? I knew too well how the world often dismissed the testimonies of women like me, especially older black women who were seen as bitter, unstable, or angry. Still, the sight of the bruise gave me something I hadn't had the night before: a plan. That afternoon, I walked to the house of my neighbor, Gloria, a retired nurse who had lived on the street for as long as I had. She opened the door with a warmth I hadn't felt in days, pulling me into a hug before I could say a word. "Mary, you look tired," she said softly, leading me into her kitchen where the smell of sweet bread filled the air. I sat at her table, and for the first time in years allowed myself to speak openly about what was happening inside my house. I told her about the spit on my face, the lies Kayla had spun, the silence of my son, the visit from the social workers. As I spoke, tears fell freely down my cheeks, tears I had held back in my own home because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Gloria listened without interruption, her eyes sharp and filled with something I recognized: anger disguised as patience. When I rolled back my sleeve to show her the bruise, she let out a sharp breath. "You need to document this," she said firmly, her nurse's instinct kicking in. "You need to protect yourself. They're trying to take everything from you." She stood, went to her cabinet, and pulled out a small digital camera. She took several photos, each one capturing the discoloration, each one freezing the truth in time. She promised she would keep copies, just in case mine ever went missing. Gloria told me she had often heard raised voices coming from my house, not mine, but Kayla's, sharp and cruel, cutting through the night air. She had even once seen Jaden shove past me on the porch, nearly knocking me off the steps. She offered to write a statement, to testify if necessary, because she said she had watched me for years and knew the kind of woman I was. That promise lit a small flame in my chest, the first flicker of hope that I wasn't as alone as they wanted me to believe. Over the next few days, I moved carefully through the house, watching everything, recording what I could in a small notebook I kept hidden beneath my mattress. I wrote down times, dates, things that were said, moments when Kayla forgot to give Jaden his allergy medicine until I reminded her, or when Mark made snide comments about how old people shouldn't be handling money. Every word felt like evidence, every scribble a weapon for the battle I knew was coming. I watched Jaden grow more hostile, throwing his backpack onto the floor, ignoring my attempts to help him with homework, calling me crazy under his breath when he thought I couldn't hear. The boy I once adored had become a stranger, and though I wanted to believe there was still good in him, the pressure of his parents' manipulation was pushing him further away from me every day. The real turning point came a week later, when the social workers returned unannounced. They arrived early in the morning, catching me still in my robe, the smell of oatmeal cooking on the stove. I opened the door, my heart pounding, and let them in. Kayla appeared almost instantly, as if she had been waiting for them, her hair done, her clothes perfect, her smile dripping with innocence. She greeted them like old friends, offering coffee, ushering them into the living room. Mark followed, his tie neatly knotted, his voice soft with feigned concern. Jaden came down the stairs, rubbing his eyes, playing the role of the weary child. I stood apart, watching the performance unfold, my stomach knotted with dread. They began asking questions again, this time sharper, more specific. They asked Jaden if he had felt afraid recently, and he nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. They asked Kayla if she had concerns about my memory, and she spoke at length about how I sometimes forgot things, about how I once left the oven on, about how she feared I was losing touch with reality. None of it was true, but it sounded plausible enough to people who didn't know me. The more she spoke, the more I saw the workers nod, and I felt the walls closing in. But then, something shifted. One of the workers asked if there had been any incidents of aggression in the past week, and Kayla hesitated just slightly, glancing at Jaden. It was the kind of hesitation that betrayed too much, the kind that comes when a lie has to be constructed on the spot. I seized the moment. I rolled up my sleeve and revealed the fading bruise on my arm. "Yes," I said firmly. "There has been aggression, but not from me. This is what your so-called victim did to me when I told him to do his homework. This is the truth you're not being told." The room fell silent for a moment, and I saw the younger social worker's eyes widen as she took in the mark. She leaned forward, asked when it had happened, asked if there was a witness. I told her that Gloria, my neighbour, had seen the aftermath and had taken photographs. I watched as the power in the room shifted slightly, as the workers scribbled notes with a different urgency. Kayla sputtered, trying to explain it away, saying I must have bumped into something. But the seed of doubt had now been planted in their narrative. That was the midpoint of the battle, the moment when I realized I was not entirely powerless. For every lie they told, I had begun to collect truths backed by evidence, by witnesses, by the marks on my body. I could feel the tide turning, not fully in my favor yet, but no longer entirely against me. The bruise that once felt like a mark of shame had become my leverage, the proof that I was not the monster they claimed, but the one enduring cruelty. I sat taller, spoke more firmly, and when they left that day, their faces were less certain, less convinced by Kayla's performance. For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, a recognition that I might not go down quietly after all. The first glimpse of hope I had begun to feel after showing the bruise did not last long, because only a few days later the ground shifted again beneath me in a way that felt calculated and cruel. I came home from the grocery store, arms heavy with bags filled with the food I had purchased with the last of my pension check, and found 2 envelopes slid under the door. One bore the stamp of Child Protective Services, and the other was from the county courthouse. My stomach dropped before I even opened them, because I knew that paper carries more weight in this country than truth, and those pages could erase years of sacrifice in a matter of sentences. I set the groceries down on the counter, my hands trembling as I tore them open. The letter from CPS stated that after the second visit, due to multiple corroborated concerns, they were opening a formal investigation into my household. The courthouse letter was worse. It was a notice of a petition filed by Mark and Kayla, alleging that I was mentally unfit to manage the home and finances, and requesting temporary guardianship over both Jaden and the property itself. I read the words over and over, hardly believing that my own son had signed his name to a document designed to strip me of my dignity, my independence, and the roof I had worked a lifetime to secure. The unfairness of it all struck me so violently that I nearly collapsed onto the kitchen floor. Only days earlier, the bruise had given me a measure of leverage, a small thread of truth to hold on to. Yet here they were, escalating their attack by pulling the legal system into their scheme. They weren't content with poisoning the social workers against me. Now they were dragging my name into court, turning lies into official filings. I thought back to every overtime shift I had worked when Mark was a boy. Every night I had walked home in the dark because the buses had stopped running. Every time I had gone without so that he could have what he needed. And this was my repayment. A petition declaring me incompetent, signed by the child I had raised from scratch, co-signed by the woman who despised me from the day she married him. When I confronted Mark that evening, his eyes slid away from mine, as though he couldn't bear to face the truth of what he had done. Kayla, however, met my gaze with a smugness that made my blood burn. She told me coldly that it was for the best, that I was clearly struggling, that they had to protect Jaden from instability. Her words were sugar-coated poison, and I understood in that moment that she was the architect of this entire betrayal. Pushing Mark to sign papers he might never have had the courage to draft on his own. Jaden watched from the stairs, his arms crossed, his face twisted with teenage contempt. And for the first time I realized he might never come back to me, that their influence had already hardened his heart. The next day, a social worker arrived with a camera and began photographing the house. She opened cupboards, took pictures of the refrigerator, snapped shots of the laundry room, the closets, even the medicine cabinet. Kayla had prepared for this. I saw it in the way she had deliberately left dishes unwashed in the sink, in the way she had scattered Jaden's dirty clothes across the floor of his room, in the way she had taken a half-empty bottle of expired pills and placed it where it would be, noticed. The worker photographed it all, nodding grimly as if confirming suspicions. I wanted to shout that it was staged, that the mess was not mine, that the pills had been planted, but I knew how it would sound. Another denial, another excuse from an old woman painted as unstable. The injustice of it pressed down on me until my chest ached, because I could see how the evidence was being manufactured in plain sight and yet had no power to stop it. That evening I called Gloria and showed her the court petition. She read it carefully, her lips pursed tight, and said what I already knew. They're trying to take the house. She reminded me that this kind of tactic had been used before against women like us, that guardianship battles had long been a weapon to rob elders of property they had fought decades to secure. Her words didn't ease the sting, but they lit a deeper fire inside me. I refused to let them succeed, even if the system was stacked in their favor. I began gathering every receipt, every bill paid in my name, every photograph of family gatherings in this house that proved it had always been my domain. I knew it might not matter to a court blinded by their lies, but I needed to have my truth collected, ready to be unleashed at the right time. What made this turn especially cruel was not just the legal maneuvering, but the emotional isolation that came with it. Mark stopped speaking to me, except through clipped sentences, as though I were a tenant awaiting eviction rather than his mother. Kayla paraded around the house as if she already owned it, making small changes, moving my picture frames, replacing my curtains, rearranging my kitchen drawers, as though erasing me little by little before the court had even ruled. Jaden sneered openly, calling me crazy to my face, daring me to react so that he could use my anger against me. The walls of the home I had built began to feel like a cage, every corner weaponized against me. The injustice reached its peak when I received a call from the school counselor, who told me that Jaden had confided that his grandmother sometimes yells and makes him afraid. The counselor's voice was heavy with concern, and she explained that the school was required to pass that information on to CPS. I wanted to scream that this was another lie, another manipulation fed to him by his parents, but I knew the damage was already done. Each lie layered upon the next, until the picture of me that existed in official records was unrecognizable, a grotesque caricature of the woman I truly was. It was then I understood the full scale of the battle. It was no longer just about defending my dignity in my own house. It was about defending my right to exist as a capable, respected elder in a society eager to sideline women like me. The unfair twist was not only the betrayal of my family, but the speed with which the system believed them, the way their accusations became official truths, while my lived reality was dismissed as the rantings of an old woman. Standing in my living room with the petition papers spread across the table, I felt the weight of history pressing on my shoulders. Generations of black women fighting to be heard, to be believed, to be seen as more than burdens or stereotypes. And I swore to myself that I would not let them take everything from me without a fight that shook the ground beneath their lies. The weeks that followed were like living inside a storm that would not pass, the kind where the rain doesn't fall in sheets, but instead lingers as a relentless drizzle, soaking you slowly until you are drenched and heavy with despair. The petition filed by Mark and Kayla had set in motion a process that seemed designed to break me down step by step. Letters kept arriving, stamped with the seal of agencies that held my life in their hands, each one demanding paperwork, interviews, inspections. It was as though I had become a defendant in a trial where I didn't even know the charges until they were hurled at me, accusations that twisted my every action into evidence of incompetence. I learned quickly that the system didn't need proof. Suspicion was enough. A whispered word could turn into a documented concern. A minor mistake could become a pattern of abuse. I could feel the walls of bureaucracy closing in around me, and inside those walls, my own family sharpened their knives. Kayla began carrying herself differently, striding through the house with the authority of someone who believed victory was inevitable. She stopped pretending to respect my space, opening my mail before I could get to it, rearranging the kitchen cabinets as though she had been crowned the new matriarch. Mark followed her lead, silent and sullen, avoiding confrontation but never once stepping in to defend me. Jaden grew bolder, rolling his eyes when I spoke, laughing with his mother about my forgetfulness, leaving messes in every room because he knew the social workers would photograph them and mark them down as evidence of neglect. Every action in my home had become theatre, every corner a stage set for my downfall. But if they thought I would crumble quietly, they had forgotten who I was and what I had endured to get here. I began to build my own arsenal, not of weapons, but of truth, carefully gathered and preserved. Gloria became my anchor, her presence a reminder that there were still people willing to see me clearly. She helped me make copies of every receipt showing that I bought groceries, every utility bill with my name on it, every deposit slip from my pension. She showed me how to organize them into folders so that when the time came, I would not be fumbling for proof, but ready to lay out a record of my life. She also introduced me to a retired lawyer from her church, a man who agreed to look at the court papers without charge. He warned me that guardianship cases were tricky, that the courts often leaned toward younger family members if they painted a convincing story of concern. But he also told me that my documentation could be my shield if I was consistent. His advice lit a spark in me. If they wanted to make this a battle of narratives, I would arm myself with the truth, written, dated, undeniable. The escalation came one night when CPS arrived again, this time accompanied by a police officer. The knock on the door was not gentle. It was loud, authoritative, the kind that announces both suspicion and power. I opened it, my heart hammering, and saw two social workers, one new and one familiar, with the officer standing behind them like a silent enforcer. They told me they had received a report of possible physical danger in the home and needed to do a welfare check immediately. My blood ran cold because I knew exactly who had made that call, and I knew exactly what lies it carried. They entered without hesitation, their eyes scanning every corner while Kayla performed her act of worried mother, wringing her hands and casting me glances heavy with accusation. Jaden, ever the eager actor now, claimed that I had shouted at him, that I had threatened to put him in his place. Words I had never spoken, but ones carefully chosen to fit the narrative of abuse. The police officer stood by silently, his presence enough to make me feel like a criminal in my own home. I tried to explain, my voice steady but trembling beneath the surface, that these were lies, that I had done nothing but provide for the boy. But every word I spoke seemed to disappear into the void. The social worker asked to see my bedroom, to inspect the kitchen, to check the bathroom for signs of neglect. I followed them as they moved through my space, their pens scratching notes, their faces unreadable. When they came across the bruise photos I had tucked into a folder on my dresser, they glanced at them briefly, but said nothing, slipping them back as though they were irrelevant. I realized then that truth was only valuable if someone wanted to hear it. And these women had come not to seek truth, but to confirm a suspicion already planted. The visit ended with them warning me that the investigation was ongoing and that further action might be necessary. As they left, the police officer gave me a look I couldn't quite read. Pity, maybe, or doubt. But it was gone too quickly to matter. The door closed behind them, and Kayla exhaled in exaggerated relief, saying to Mark, "Finally, they're starting to see what's happening here." The cruelty of her words stung, not because they were new, but because she delivered them with such calm certainty, as though my destruction was not just possible, but guaranteed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark of my bedroom, the moonlight casting long shadows across the walls, and thought about every woman I had known who had been silenced, every elder pushed out of her own home, every story erased by the louder voices of those who claimed to know better. I thought about my mother, who had told me to stand tall even when the world bent against me. And I thought about the generations before me who had been denied property, dignity, and justice, but had fought anyway. Their strength surged in me, and I realized that while the system might be slow to see the truth, I had something my family did not: resilience carved from decades of survival. The second escalation wasn't only in the visits and the paperwork. It was in the way the lies began spreading outside the house. Neighbors who once greeted me warmly now looked at me with cautious eyes, whispers passing between them as I walked down the street. I overheard someone at the grocery store say, "Isn't that the woman with CPS at her door all the time?" My reputation, once built on years of being dependable, trustworthy, the one people called for help, was being chipped away by rumors planted by the very people I had helped most. It was a different kind of violence, one that didn't bruise the skin, but corroded the spirit. And yet it only steeled my resolve to fight harder. I began to record conversations in the house, hiding my phone in my pocket or leaving it on the counter when Kayla and Mark argued. More than once I captured her yelling at Jaden, berating him for not cleaning his room, cursing under her breath when she thought I was out of earshot. I knew that these recordings might not hold up in court, but they were truth-preserved, proof that the chaos did not come from me. I collected them alongside my receipts and photos, a growing archive of my defense. Gloria reminded me daily that I had to remain calm, that any outburst could be used against me. And I clung to her words, even when rage boiled inside me so fiercely I thought it might split me in two. As the days dragged on, the second escalation became clear. This was no longer a private family betrayal, but a full assault, using every tool of the state and society to isolate me. They were pushing me toward a corner where I would either collapse or explode, and they were betting on the latter so they could point and say, "See, we told you she was unstable." But what they didn't realize was that I had spent my whole life learning how to endure storms, how to bend without breaking, how to gather strength from the very earth beneath me. If they wanted escalation, they would get it, but not the way they expected. I was preparing for my turn, and when it came, the weight of my truth would not just defend me, but expose them. The day of the hearing arrived like a storm cloud that had been gathering for weeks, heavy and oppressive. And when the morning came, I felt the weight of every sleepless night pressing against my chest. I dressed slowly, deliberately, in the navy blue dress I had worn to my husband's funeral, because it was the one garment in my closet that carried both dignity and mourning, a reminder of what I had lost and of the strength that had carried me through. I pinned my hair back the way my mother used to when she wanted to appear in control. And I looked in the mirror, not for beauty, but for resolve. My face was lined, my eyes tired, but there was a steel inside me that no one in that courtroom could erase. When Gloria arrived to pick me up, she carried with her a folder filled with photographs, receipts, and her own written statement. "We are not going in there alone," she whispered, squeezing my hand. And for the first time in weeks, I believed it. The courthouse itself was cold, its marble floors echoing with the footsteps of strangers whose lives were also being decided in small rooms behind closed doors. We were ushered into a chamber where a judge sat high above us, a man whose expression was carefully blank, the kind of blankness that suggested he had already made 1,000 judgments before hearing a single word. Mark and Kayla were seated at the opposite table, dressed like a picture-perfect family. Kayla in a pale suit, her hair immaculate, Mark in a crisp tie, and Jaden between them, his shoulders hunched, his expression carefully schooled into innocence. They looked like a family seeking protection. And I knew instantly that this was the image they wanted the court to see. Them as victims, me as the unstable elder clinging to control. Their lawyer spoke first, his words smooth and practiced, outlining how I was allegedly unfit to manage my home, how I had become verbally aggressive, how Jaden had expressed fear, how I was forgetful, how I had endangered the stability of the household. He produced photographs of the messy rooms Kayla had staged, the expired pills she had planted, the school counselor's note repeating Jaden's carefully rehearsed lies. Each piece of evidence landed like a stone, stacking into a wall that seemed designed to bury me alive. My heart pounded, but I sat still, reminding myself that I had truth on my side, that my turn was coming. When the lawyer finished, the judge turned his gaze to me, and I rose slowly, holding onto the edge of the table for balance. My own lawyer, the retired man Gloria had introduced me to, nodded for me to begin. I spoke not with fury, but with calm precision, because I knew anger would be twisted into proof of instability. I began with my history, with the decades I had worked to buy and keep the house, with the years of providing for Mark as a single mother, with the sacrifices made so that Jaden could grow up in a home that was safe, warm, and steady. I spoke of my pension checks, of the bills in my name, of the food purchased with my own money. I handed the judge copies of receipts, utility statements, bank slips, all neatly organized. I rolled up my sleeve and showed the fading bruise, then presented the photographs Gloria had taken, and I told the court plainly, "This is not the mark of a child living in fear. This is the mark of a grandmother enduring aggression." Gloria took the stand next, her voice firm, recounting the nights she had heard Kayla shouting, the days she had seen Jaden shove me on the porch, the moment she had taken the photographs to protect me. She told the judge that she had known me for decades, that I had never been unstable, that I had always been the backbone of my family and my neighborhood. Her words carried the weight of lived history, and I saw the judge's expression shift slightly, the first crack in the wall of certainty built by Mark and Kayla's lies. Then, when it seemed like the case might tip toward balance, my lawyer played one of the recordings I had made in the kitchen, the one where Kayla's voice was sharp and venomous as she berated Jaden for not cleaning, her words laced with curses, her tone dripping with contempt. The sound filled the courtroom, undeniable, unedited, a raw truth that shattered the polished image she had tried to project. Kayla's face blanched, Mark shifted uncomfortably, and even Jaden's mask slipped for a moment as his eyes widened. The judge leaned forward, listening intently, and when the recording ended, the silence in the room was heavier than any argument spoken before it. I took that silence and filled it with the words that had been building inside me for weeks. I told the judge that I was not perfect, that I was tired, that I had carried burdens no one in my family had acknowledged, but that I was not abusive, unstable, or unfit. I told him that what was happening was not about Jaden's safety, but about greed, about a family trying to strip a black elder woman of her home and dignity. I spoke of history, of how often women like me were painted as angry, bitter, or incapable, and how those stereotypes were being weaponized against me now. I ended simply, looking him in the eye. This house is mine. My life is mine, and I will not be erased. The climax unfolded not with shouting, but with the weight of truth pressing against lies until they cracked. The judge did not render his decision immediately, but his closing words were sharp, directed at Mark and Kayla, reminding them that evidence of manipulation had been introduced, that false statements carried consequences, that the court would not be used as a weapon in family disputes without proof. As we left the chamber, Kayla's face was a mask of fury barely contained. Mark looked smaller than I had ever seen him, and Jaden could not meet my eyes. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt the first breath of air that was not poisoned by lies. The battle was not yet won. The war still loomed ahead. But in that room, in that moment, the truth had broken through. And for the first time since that cursed Thanksgiving, I felt the weight shift in my favor. The weeks after the hearing unfolded in slow motion, as though the world itself wanted me to sit with the aftermath of every word spoken in that courtroom, every glance exchanged, every truth finally forced into the light. I waited for the judge's written decision the way a condemned woman waits for a final verdict, each day dragging into the next, my mornings marked not by the comfort of coffee and prayer, but by the heavy weight of uncertainty. Yet even in that waiting, something inside me shifted. The fear that had been strangling me since Thanksgiving began to loosen its grip, replaced by a quiet steadiness I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, I believed that my voice mattered, that my truth had pierced through the wall of lies, and that belief itself carried me like a lifeline through the endless days of silence. When the decision finally arrived, sealed in an envelope as plain as any bill, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at it for a long time before breaking the flap. My hands shook, not from weakness, but from the gravity of what it meant. Inside, the judge's words spread across several pages, carefully measured, stripped of emotion, but heavy with consequence. The petition for guardianship was denied. The court found insufficient evidence to declare me unfit, and instead, the judge noted concerns about the credibility of Mark and Kayla's claims, especially in light of the audio recordings and the testimony provided by my neighbor. The case was closed, pending no new evidence, and while CPS would continue periodic check-ins, the immediate threat to my independence, my home, and my dignity was removed. I read the words 3 times before I allowed myself to breathe, and when the realization settled in, I cried. Not the silent tears of despair I had shed so often these past weeks, but deep, shaking sobs of release, of relief, of survival. The house felt different after that. Not because Mark and Kayla disappeared, but because the power they had wielded over me fractured the moment the court sided with truth. Kayla still strutted through the kitchen, still tried to exert control, but her voice no longer rang with the same confidence. Mark avoided me even more, unable to meet my eyes, as though the shame of his betrayal clung to him like a shadow. Jaden retreated into himself, his arrogance dimmed, though he still avoided any sign of remorse. I did not expect an apology, not from any of them. What I carried now was not the hope that they would change, but the knowledge that I had survived them, that I had defended my place in the world and won. The real shift came not inside the house, but outside, in the way the community responded. Gloria had told others what she had seen, what she had done to help me, and slowly neighbors began to approach me again, offering small words of encouragement, nods of solidarity, reminders that they had not believed every rumor whispered by Kayla. At church, when I walked in on Sunday, women clasped my hands and held them tight, telling me they admired my strength, that they had watched and prayed for me. It was then I realized that my fight had not been just for myself. It had been a fight for every older woman who had ever been silenced, every grandmother erased by lies, every black matriarch stripped of her voice. By standing tall in that courtroom, by refusing to be erased, I had carved out space for others like me to see that they, too, could resist. I began to reclaim the rhythms of my life. I cooked meals not out of duty, but because I wanted to taste the food I had grown up with, flavors that reminded me of my mother's hands. I took walks with Gloria, letting the sun touch my face without the shadow of fear hovering behind me. I even joined her church group's book club, something I had always put off because my life had been consumed by caring for everyone else. For the first time in decades, I placed myself at the center of my own life, and it felt both strange and liberating. But the unraveling of my family still weighed on me. There were nights when I lay awake thinking of the boy Jaden had once been, wondering if he would ever see me again, not as an enemy, but as the grandmother who had loved him fiercely. I thought of Mark, of how he had once run to me with scraped knees and tears in his eyes, how I had been his safe place, and how now he had chosen to turn that safety into betrayal. Those memories ached, but I refused to let them define me. What I had learned was that blood alone does not determine family, that loyalty and respect mean more than shared names, and that sometimes survival means closing doors on people you once thought would always stand beside you. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Gloria sat beside me and said something that stayed with me. They wanted to erase you, but instead you carved your story into stone. They'll have to live with the shame of what they tried to do. You, Mary, you'll live with the strength of what you did to stop them. I held her words close, because they named the truth I had struggled to articulate. What happened had not broken me. It had forged me into something sharper, something steadier, something unshakable. Thanksgiving would never be the same again. The memory of spit on my face, the silence of my son, the lies told under my own roof would always haunt that holiday, but I refused to let it define the rest of my life. The next year, when November rolled around, I did not cook a turkey for them. Instead, I invited Gloria and a few other women from church, and together we made a small meal, humble but joyful. We prayed over the food, not for the family who had betrayed me, but for the strength to keep living with dignity, for the courage to keep resisting when the world tried to silence us, for the blessing of knowing that survival itself was a form of victory. And as we ate together, laughing and sharing stories, I felt something I had not felt in a long time: peace. The fight had scarred me, but it had not ended me. My house still stood, my voice still carried, my dignity still glowed, and as long as I had breath, no one would take that from me again.